Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling incidents in history, which took place in Washington State's northern Cascade Mountains. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. It was precisely 37 a.m. when the radio crackled to life. On October 12th, 1959, Marlene, the night dispatcher at the Olympic National Forest Ranger Station. Later, Voss would testify that the voice on the other end was hardly identifiable as Senior Ranger Harlan Mercer's. The voice had stated, "There's something wrong with this place." Mercer's voice resumed after 12 seconds of static interruption. "There is no survey that matches the location. There is no map of this cottage." Then there was a 23-day silence on the radio. Ranger Harlan Mercer's disappearance could have remained just another enigmatic disappearance in the vast. If not for the journal found during the ensuing search, the Pacific Northwest would have been a wilderness. The writings in the leather-bound notebook covered the period from October 9th to November 2nd, 1959. Which was 11 days after Mercer's last radio broadcast. Ranger Mercer himself was never located by the search crew that uncovered the journal, according to official Forest Service records. The disparity in the official reporting is what makes this instance especially troubling. The journal's location coordinates. Recovered conform to the absence of any cabin or structure in any previous or subsequent Forest Service survey. However, in progressively shattered handwriting, Mercer's journal describes a 2-story cottage with a stone foundation tucked away in a tiny clearing, a building that, by all official records, has never been there. Before going missing, Harlan Mercer had been a ranger at Olympic National Forest for 17 years. Colleagues said he was methodical, composed, and incredibly knowledgeable about the area under his authority. If anyone knew every inch of the northern section, it was Harlan, Vernon Whitaker, a former forest supervisor, stated in a 1961 interview. The man could navigate those woods blindfolded. That's what makes his final report so unsettling. The Pacific Northwest had experienced an exceptionally wet and frigid autumn in 1959. According to Seattle's rainfall data, September and October precipitation was 142% higher than usual. River levels were high, and a number of logging roads had been completely washed out. Ranger Mercer initially noticed what he considered an irregularity in his patrol notes while conducting a standard evaluation of storm damage. 3 days prior to his last radio broadcast, on October 9th, Mercer wrote, "Discovered unusual trail branching northwest from milepost 27 on Coldwater Road. Trail appears recently used despite heavy rainfall. Not marked on current survey maps. Will investigate tomorrow if weather permits." The next day's entry says, "Weather." Ranger Mercer's findings on October 11th would significantly alter the tone of his typically clinical reports. "Will return with proper equipment to map this section tomorrow. The path shows signs of regular use, but it doesn't match any recreational or service route on forest maps. We noticed unusual silence. No bird calls or wildlife sounds for the final mile of hiking." His 4-page diary entry from that period contains numerous in-depth drawings. As the entry goes on, the handwriting, which is often exact and measured, gets more agitated. Although there is no record of private property or permitted buildings in this sector, the 2-story cabin at coordinates 47 degrees 51 PU4 and 123 degrees 4018 7W looks well maintained. It has a stone foundation structure and a cedar shingle exterior that is about 24 x 36 fonts. The closest road terminus is 3 to 7 miles southeast. Later in the same entry. Inspection of the perimeter demonstrates several discrepancies. Fallen leaves and forest debris surrounding the foundation suggest recent construction, while the building materials appear aged, suggesting decades of exposure. Despite the main track appearing to be frequently used, no trails have been worn into the surrounding earth. Despite the indoor fireplace being visible via windows, there was no smoke coming from the chimney. No answer to vocal cries. If an unapproved structure was discovered, Mercer's training methodology would have required prompt reporting, documentation, and notification to his superiors. Rather, according to his notebook, he set up camp about 300 yards from the cabin with the intention of doing more research the next morning. Only ordinary patrol duties were mentioned in his radio check-in that evening. On October 12th, the day of his last radio broadcast, the journal entry starts off as usual. At 6:23, dawn broke. Visibility beyond 50 yards is obscured by dense ground fog. Through the mist, the temperature is still about 38 degrees. During night watch, no indications of habitation were seen. Eritim at 9:30. Mercer captured a direct approach to the cabin. The door unlocked. The interior looks well maintained. There are supplies, furniture, and personal belongings. The wood piled beside the fireplace is dry. The grate and ash are fresh but cold. The kitchen's food supplies are clean. There are a number of books on the shelf, mostly local history and surveying guides. No identifying documentation or photos are visible. Mercer seems to have been deeply troubled by what he found next. His handwriting clearly deteriorates, and a number of words are repeated or crossed out. Ranger log book entries from 1959 up to October 11th were discovered on the desk. The handwriting corresponds to the heavily scratched out area. This is not feasible. Pages outline a patrol route that is exactly the same as mine. The last item details how an unmarked track was found that led to this spot. My equipment is set up in the cabin the way I would like it to be. With my service patch and ID number, the jacket that is hanging at the entrance is the same as the usual problem, the rest of the observations in the October 12th entry are becoming more fragmented. Given the level clearing where he stood, Mercer observes that the coordinates he recorded place the cabin in the middle of a steep ravine, which is topographically impossible. Additionally, he noticed that when his compass was put on specific surfaces, the needle would spin continually and give him inconsistent readings inside the building. Mercer recorded his choice to radio for help at 15:17 hours. This is consistent with. Marlene Voss, the dispatch operator, received the transmission. He planned to set up a perimeter and wait for help, according to the log. Will maintain observation from tree line until support arrives. Something is wrong with the dimensions of this place. Shadows fall at incorrect angles inside. The last line of that day's entry states, "Will maintain observation from tree line until support arrives." The entries that follow, those dated after Ranger Mercer's last radio contact, reveal the most troubling aspects of this case, as the Forest Service. Several forensic examinations of the journal carried out between 1960 and 1968 verified similar ink composition and handwriting throughout the manuscript, despite officials' initial dismissal of these as fakes or proof of psychological suffering. On October 13th, the radio was only hearing static, and there was no sign of the backup crew. Slept through the night in shifts. The person in the cabin has not shown up. I tried hiking out this morning to go to the police car, but the trail now goes farther than it did before. Walked for 3 hours prior to. I became aware that I was going in a circle. My tree markings still led back to the cleared hut. Tomorrow, we'll try a different approach. October 14th. Trail confusion persists. Regardless of the path traveled, every attempt to depart returns to clearing. Unreliable compass readings. Time measurements are in conflict with the sun's location. Every hour, cloud formations follow the same patterns. The cabin is still empty, but every morning it displays evidence of recent occupancy. However, I discovered fresh coffee in the pot today. I didn't make any. By October 16th, Mercer's entries indicate that he had made the tough choice to take refuge in the cabin instead of making more unsuccessful attempts to flee or sleep outside. In his essays, the psychological effects of his circumstances become more and more obvious. Inside these walls, sleep is different. Dreams are regular and vivid. From the treeing, I am observing myself. The perspective keeps changing as I get closer to the cabin for the first time. Within, the boundaries feel blurry when you glance out or in. Found another journal today, hidden between mattress and frame and bedroom. Contents identical to my current entries up to yesterday. Handwriting is mine. Paper and binding match Forest Service standard issue. Final page contains entry dated October 26 that I have not yet written. Will not read ahead. Sealed it in my pack. Is one particularly unsettling entry from October 19th. The mystery grew when, according to a 1962 internal, a search party was in fact sent out on October 13th, the day after Mercer's last transmission, according to Forest Service records. Under the leadership of Rangers Donovan Walsh and Seymour Gideon, the team reported following Mercer's last known coordinates, but finding no trail that matched his description. After 4 days of intense searching and worsening weather, the operation was downgraded to a recovery mission rather than a rescue, but Mercer's journal entries continued during this time, showing an increasingly bizarre experience. October 21st. Time passes incorrectly here. The watch stopped at 3:17. It matches the time of the radio call 5 days ago, but it feels longer. The cabin seems to expand at night. Steps from the front door to the back wall were counted. They were 37 after dark and 22 during the day. The dimensions should be impossible given external measurements. October 23rd. Today I discovered scratches inside the closet door. Tally marks were grouped in sets of 5. I counted 142 marks in handwriting that resemble mine. Cycles were finished. I began to hear a voice. By October 25th, Mercer's writing demonstrates signs of severe sleep deprivation and possible psychological breakdown, describing the cabin as breathing, and claiming to have seen the structure fold in on itself at precisely 3:17 each morning, revealing the same rooms arranged in impossible configurations. The October 26th entry is particularly significant because it supposedly matches the future entry Mercer had discovered in his journal. Last night, coming through. Heeding great voice is mine, reciting my journal entries before I write them. The secret journal a week ago. The ranger shows up tomorrow, and I watch from the trees as he finds the trail. I have left everything exactly as it was left for me. The cycle needs to continue. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe I will warn him away. On October 29th, Mercer wrote what seems to be his most lucid reflection. I now understand. This isn't the first cabin, it's the only cabin encountered repeatedly. The Forest Service will find this journal as they. The journal was eventually found on November 4th, 1959, inside a standard-issue Forest Service backpack in the hollow of a large cedar tree. They will disregard these entries. The next ranger will arrive. The coordinates will lead nowhere until they need to lead somewhere. The trail appears when it needs to appear. The last entry, dated November 2nd, is just one line. I am going outside now. I think I see myself approaching through the trees. The most unsettling of all was that the coordinates listed in Mercer's journal, the supposed location of the cabin, corresponded to a sheer rock face that dropped more than 200 feet to a riverbed below. Senior geologist Hamilton Pierce from the U.S. Geological Survey was brought in to consult on the case in 1960, and he confirmed that the topography of the area had remained unchanged for at least 3 weeks. The journal was classified as evidence and kept in the Regional Forest Service archives for at least 5,100 years, with no indication that any clearing or structural foundation had ever existed there. Ranger Harlan Mercer was listed as missing in the official report filed on November 18, 1959, and it was assumed that he had died from exposure or an accident while performing his duties. In 1968, while microfilming historical records, archive technicians reported that the journal was missing even though it had been correctly logged in the inventory system. The disappearance of an experienced ranger and the discovery of an anomalous journal are not what make this case particularly disturbing. Rather, it is what happened in the decades that followed. Ranger Donovan Walsh, who had been involved in the initial search for Mercer, filed an incident report in 1963 stating that he had found an unmarked trail branching northwest from milepost 27 on Coldwater Road, the precise location cited in Mercer's first journal entry. In 1967, 2 backpackers reported seeking shelter in an abandoned cabin during a sudden storm. The coordinates they provided placed them in a section of Olympic National Forest with no registered structures. When rangers investigated 3 days later, they found no cabin and no clearing, only dense forest. He followed the trail for about a mile before turning back because it was getting dark. Supervisor Whitaker, who had retired from service the following month, denied his request for a follow-up investigation. Ranger Julen Caldwell, who was unaware of the Mercer incident, reported discovering a weathered journal inside a hollow cedar tree while conducting a wildlife survey. According to her statement, the journal contained entries from an unidentified ranger describing a cabin that existed in the same space as multiple other cabins. Before she could return to the ranger station with this evidence, the most recent known link to the Mercer case dates back to 1981, when a routine audit of Forest Service personnel records found an anomaly. In the staff directory for Olympic National Forest under rangers assigned to the North District, the name Harlan Mercer appeared with a higher date of October 9, 1980, exactly 21 years after Mercer's original discovery of the unmarked trail. The journal was reportedly lost during the evacuation. The area where Mercer vanished was mostly reclaimed by wilderness in the decades that followed. In 1984, a powerful storm caused massive flooding and landslides throughout the region, permanently altering many topographical features. The administrative clerk in charge of keeping the records had no memory of adding the name, and no personnel file could be found. The entry was dismissed as a clerical error, possibly due to someone accessing historical records during the system update. Coldwater Road was partially rerouted, and milepost 27, the landmark in Mercer's original report, is no longer visible on modern maps. What happened to Ranger Harlan Mercer? The official position is still the same. The journal entries depict the psychological decline of a man facing mortality alone in the wilderness, and the references to impossible architecture and temporal anomalies are attributed to hypothermia, which is known to cause hallucinations, and cognitive distortions, but some details defy this easy explanation. The forensic analysis verifying that all journal entries were written by the same hand and with the same ink. The consistent testimony of unrelated witnesses describing similar phenomena in the same general area over decades. The unexplained presence of Mercer's name and personnel records 21 years after his disappearance, and a statement made by one of Mercer's co-workers in 1962 during the internal investigation. Ranger Edmund Covett said, "The week before he disappeared, Harlan told me something that I didn't think much of at the time, which was later removed from the official report. I asked him what he meant, but he simply shook his head and said it probably came from spending too much time in the forest. He claimed to have been having the same dream over and over again, saying he was walking through the forest and found himself sitting in a cabin. He said he always had the same thought in the dream, This time, I'll tell him not to stay. Much time spent alone in the woods. Dr. Lydia Montgomery, a geophysicist who studied magnetic anomalies in the Olympic Peninsula in the late 1960s, noted several terrestrial blind spots where magnetic readings became unpredictable. In a footnote to her published findings, she cited the Mercer case, specifically specific locations within the survey area exhibit. This is perhaps the most plausible theory, if one can use plausible in this context. If Ranger Mercer's account is accepted at face value, it implies that he may have come across such a phenomenon. Dr. Montgomery's career suffered after the publication of her study. Properties consistent with theoretical fold points in spaceme, regions where conventional physical laws governing three-dimensional space may temporarily operate according to alternative parameters. These anomalies appear transient rather than fixed, which explains the difficulty in documenting them consistently. The forests of the Olympic Peninsula continue to attract hikers, campers, and nature lovers from all over the world. Occasionally, visitors report strange experiences, periods of unnatural silence, trails that seem to lead in circles despite straightforward terrain, and the feeling of being watched from within the dense forest canopy. Her field notes and raw data were archived at the University of Washington, but they were reportedly destroyed in a storage facility fire in 1973. In the area where Mercer vanished, official Forest Service policy now mandates that rangers patrol in pairs. When questioned about this procedure during a budget review in 1993, Regional Supervisor Carlton Merritt claimed it was a standard safety measure for particularly remote terrain, but internal documents obtained through a Freedom of Information request show that park rangers typically attribute these accounts to the confusing nature of old-growth forests, where massive trees can obscure landmarks and create natural echo chambers. The Mercer case file was officially closed in 1969, 10 years after his disappearance, when the statutory period for maintaining active missing persons investigations expired. The journal's last known location was Archival Box 47C in the Olympic National Forest Regional Office. In 1997, a different directive was revealed. Personnel are advised to immediately report any structures not appearing on current survey maps and to retreat to established ranger stations without further investigation. When they accessed it in 1985 for a retrospective on historical mysteries of the Pacific Northwest, they were told that the file only included standard incident reports and that the inventory did not include a journal. What is left is a story that defies easy explanation. A ranger with impeccable credentials and intimate knowledge of the terrain came upon something that exists both nowhere and everywhere in the deep woods of the Olympic Peninsula. A cabin that appears where no cabin should be possible, a structure that, according to, for those who patrol the forests today, Mercer's disappearance has faded into wilderness folklore, a warning about the perils of isolation and the harshness of the backcountry. However, in some ranger stations across the Pacific Northwest, an unofficial protocol still exists. If you find an unmarked trail that leads to Mercer's final theories, it may occasionally become accessible to those who happen upon the right trail at the right time. A survey team mapping erosion patterns near the original search area reported an unusual finding in the winter of 1962, nearly 3 years after Mercer's disappearance. During a break in a severe winter storm, team leader Garrison Westfield noticed what appeared to be light from a cabin window approximately half a mile from their location. If the anomaly doesn't appear on your maps, especially near old mile markers, mark your location clearly. Report the anomaly immediately and under no circumstances follow where it leads. The team found only intact forest in the direction Westfield had indicated, with no signs of any structure or clearing visible. In his field notes, which were later submitted with the team's geological survey, Westfield wrote, Possible light source observed 111462 bearing 293 degrees from Camp Point Alpha Easter's distance 05 meters. Considering the dangerous conditions, he decided not to investigate, instead noting compass bearings and approximate distance. Following: no structure or signs of human activity were found during the research. This odd occurrence might be caused by the survey team's lights reflecting off the low cloud ceiling during a storm. This entry has a handwritten note in the margin that was either inserted during review or he observed what Mercer saw. The initials correspond to Vernon Whitaker, who had overseen Mercer and formally retired in 1963. Take into consideration the reassignment of staff from North District Surveys VW, the Olympic Peninsula's forests. Have a lot of secrets. Ancient trees that stood before European colonization, remote valleys totally unspoiled by human presence, fauna rarely viewed by human eyes. There is still a tacit awareness among people who work these woods that some things are inexplicable. Some experiences are kept private and shared only with those who can relate. When the Olympic Park headquarters was being renovated in 1999, workmen found a wrapped envelope beneath a weak panel in what had been Vernon Whitaker's workspace. A single sheet of paper with a hand-drawn map was inside the aged, yellowed envelope. A little rectangle labeled Anomaly, with exact coordinates that matched those in Mercer's journal, was located in the center. Fading ink is written over the bottom. Every 21 years, it comes back. Next window, October of 2001. I pray that God would pardon my actions. It is uncertain where this map is at the moment. The Olympic National Forest Administration said when asked for response that it was unaware of any paper of that kind. In a rarely referenced interview conducted just before her death in 1988, Dr. Montgomery may have the last say on the Mercer case. Our current scientific understanding of the universe is far from complete. Certain areas give the impression that reality itself folds or wrinkles not permanently, but cyclically. Like fabric bunching when squeezed from an angle, yet we are unable to realize this. What Ranger Mercer experienced might only have been a fleeting moment in our reality, an additional potential of its own. Olympic National Forest's hiking routes are still among the most stunning in the United States. Every year, millions of tourists safely pass through these historic forests. However, there is an unwritten but acknowledged procedure among seasoned wilderness rangers. Trust your compass if it disagrees with your maps. Retrace your steps right away if your compass starts spinning. Additionally, if you ever come onto a previously undiscovered track that leads to an apparent clearing that is too ideal with a "do not enter a cabin that appears to be familiar." If you can, mark your location. After that, turn around without turning around. Because if some hypotheses are right, Ranger Harlan Mercer may still be watching from a window, or possibly from the tree line someplace in those deep woods, waiting for the next journey to either break the cycle or join it. A Forest Service memo dated June 7, 1968, is the case's final formal mention. Every employee is told that talking about the Mercer event with unauthorized persons is a breach of confidentiality procedures. The formal ruling has not altered. Ranger H. Mercer was thought dead from natural causes after going missing while on duty. In accordance with Directive 173, all speculative documentation has been deleted from permanent records. Regional Director Conrad Blackwood, who had no direct involvement in the initial case but reportedly inspected the documents just before they were set to be microfilmed, signed the memorandum, archiving the identical procedure that allegedly caused the journal to disappear. In October 1959, what really happened to Ranger Harlan Mercer in those woods? Did he just get lost and give in to the weather? his journal writings revealing a mind collapsing in harsh circumstances. Did he come across an inexplicable event that beyond our comprehension of physical reality? Or is there something that sometimes shows itself in those old forests? A location that runs parallel to our reality, available to some people only in specific circumstances. The secrets of the forests are kept hidden. The seasons alter the pathways. Additionally, shadows occasionally appear to form patterns that shouldn't be conceivable given the locations of the trees generating them when light shines precisely through the tall canopy. These days, rangers operate in pairs. Seasonal updates are made to the maps. Furthermore, procedure requires prompt reporting without additional research if someone finds a track that is not indicated on those maps. In those forests, somewhere, according to a local tale, a cabin only shows up when it wants to be located. Perhaps a ranger is still keeping watch within, recording things in a notebook that will ultimately be returned to the outside world. A record of impossible that calls into question everything we believe to be true about the nature of reality. Many official and amateur researchers have tried to piece together what might have happened in those forests in the decades since Mercer vanished. An odd climatic pattern over the Olympic Peninsula during the period in question is confirmed by records from the National Weather Service from October 1959. A system of prolonged low pressure that produced what meteorologists called a stationary atmospheric anomaly. Inexplicable variations were seen in barometric readings from weather stations across the region, especially in the early morning hours between 30 and 4 a.m. Although these results were initially written off as equipment failures, a retrospective study. According to research done in 1976, they could point to what physicist Dr. Abram Silverstein referred to as localized gravitational distortion episodes. If such events exist, their implications are still controversial in the scientific community. According to theoretical models, isolated regions where spacetime functions with slightly different characteristics may be created by specific combinations of geological, magnetic, and atmospheric factors. The Olympic Peninsula's thick old growth woods with its setting where such speculative anomalies would be more likely to appear, if momentarily, is created by a special combination of iron-rich soil deposits, old magnetic rock formations, and isolated weather patterns. The ranger station's strange radio communications in the days after Mercer's disappearance are one part of the Mercer case that is rarely discussed in official paperwork. Marlene Voss, a night dispatcher, was given Mercer's last official. 3 more occurrences of fragmentary airy communication on Ranger Mercer's frequency, according to the transmission. Voss described these short bursts of static fell transmission as parts of speech that overlapped or were played backward. Despite the lack of technology in 1959 to accurately analyze such audio anomalies, Voss insisted until her retirement in 1981 that she could still identify Mercer's voice in these distorted transmissions. Her formal declaration made at the 1962 internal. This observation is part of the inquiry. Hearing Harlan's voice days after we had lost hope wasn't the only thing that troubled me. In one of the messages, he appeared to be answering questions I hadn't yet posed, as though we were having a conversation that hadn't yet taken place. The final report did not include this statement. It was not just Forest Service personnel who searched for Mercer. The project was aided by local volunteers from surrounding areas, including several. A portion of the present Olympic National Forest was part of the ancient grounds of the Quinault Indian tribe. In 1963, the tribal bulletin reported that Elder Joseph Silverwolf had cautioned against looking in specific parts of the forest, especially during the moon phase that corresponded to the disappearance in October 1959. Silverwolf clarified in a 1965 interview with a writer for the Seattle Times, "Our stories talk of places in the deep forests where the world thins, where A, When asked specifically about the Mercer case, Silverwolf said, "That ranger found one of the thin places. Perhaps he's still there. Or perhaps he's everywhere along that same trail now. Time doesn't flow straight in those places. A person might step through into somewhere else, or when else. These places don't stay fixed. They move like shadows as the seasons change. The old ones knew to avoid them." The possible relationship between the unusual and indigenous knowledge. Investigators from the government mostly ignored the circumstances surrounding Mercer's disappearance. However, internal Forest Service records from 1964 reveal that a number of Olympic National Forest locations were covertly marked as restricted zones, with only approved personnel having access. Although ecological sensitivity was cited as the justification, the borders of these zones closely match regions that native hunters and gatherers have historically avoided. Anthropological research carried out in the 1950s, these restricted locations were subtly made accessible to the public once more in the 1980s. Nevertheless, some areas are still subject to seasonal closure orders that change based on no pattern that is made public. The coordinates where Mercer claimed to have discovered the cabin were surrounded by geographical anomalies, an additional perplexing aspect of the situation. Wallace Thornan, a Forest Service seagrapher, made an effort in 1961 to make sense of the differences between the topography and Mercer's diary descriptions. His report includes this observation, which was classified until 1977. Assuming that Ranger Mercer's positions are correct, we also have to acknowledge that the topography he described is not possible there. But I have found an intriguing outlier. His mentioned clearing perfectly matches topographical data from 1937 if we translate his coordinates, which are around 0.37 miles west-northwest. Following that, in 1941, a landslide changed this area, creating the ravine that still exists today. To put it simply, Ranger Mercer gave the coordinates of a place as it was 22 years ago. There is an unresolved question at the end of Thornton's report. How could Mercer have known the exact location of a clearing that had been gone for more than 20 years prior to his birth? It appears that the forest itself defies conclusive research. A study team from the University of Washington made an effort in 1979 to carry out an extensive geological and magnetic survey of the region around Mercer's final coordinates that are known. According to their initial report, the trip was beset by equipment failures from the beginning. The readings on the compasses were inconsistent. Even when team members were speaking directly into microphones, recording equipment simply recorded static or silence, and batteries drained mysteriously quickly. 2 members of the crew grew seriously confused despite the clear weather, forcing the team to quit the research after 3 days of increasingly difficult attempts to collect useful data. Conditions and allegedly believed they were moving in a straight line while walking in circles for 4 hours. Citing conflicting initial results and significant equipment losses, the university refused to provide funding for a follow-up mission. Perhaps there is something that defies common sense about the Olympic Peninsula's deep forests. The old trees, some of which are over 1,000 years old, provide a canopy so thick that sunlight only intermittently penetrates the forest floor. Patterns. At times, sound seems to be entirely absorbed by the deep undergrowth and moss-covered trunks, while at other times it travels for unusually long distances. Time itself appears to move differently there, as fog appears and disappears with startling suddenness. After spending what seemed like hours on a trail, hikers often describe the bewildering realization that, based on their timepieces, just minutes have passed, or vice versa. The majority credit these encounters to the wilderness's inherent unsettling effects. However, these narratives resonate with something deeper for those who are familiar with the Mercer case. Seymour Gideon, a retired forest ranger who had been involved in the first hunt for Mercer, was interviewed by a small local newspaper in Port Angeles in 1987. This interview, which may be the most unsettling eyewitness story related to the Mercer disappearance, is rarely mentioned in official discussions of the case. On the fourth search day, I broke up with, from my team for a little while, just taking a minute to yourself, you know? I was only 30 yards away from the others when all of a sudden I was unable to hear them. There was a trail through the underbrush that I had not previously observed, and the forest had become utterly silent. After maybe 100 yards of following it, the woods gave way to a tiny clearing. A flat stone the size of a dinner plate was positioned precisely in the middle of the clearing. There was no cabin there. A badge from the Forest Service was placed atop the stone. I knew the number right away. Harland owned it. However, this is what still keeps me up at night. Harland's badge had been noticeably worn, with a deep scratch across the bottom right corner where he'd caught it on a fence years before. The other badge was brand new, polished, and undamaged. I felt something observing me from the trees as I reached for it. Although I never saw anyone or anything, I am very certain. I had no doubt that I wasn't by myself in that clearing. Taking the badge, I sprinted back the way I had come. The search crew informed me that I'd been gone for less than a minute when I arrived. I held the badge. I knew it was when I got back with them, but my hand was empty when I tried to show the team leader. I have never related this story in the course of an official investigation. Who would trust me? Any more insights Gideon may have had concerning his experience were lost when he passed away in 1991. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the whole issue is the lost notebook itself. If it weren't for an odd occurrence documented by archival technician Dorothy Simmons in a memo dated March 14, 1968. Its disappearance from the Forest Service archives in 1968 would have been written off as straightforward administrative error. When Simmons opened Archive Box 47C, she discovered that the Mercer Journal, which she had logged and put there the day before, was gone. Simmons was tasked with getting papers ready for microfilming. The next morning. This insight is part of her memo. Not only was the diary missing, but the inventory sheet had no indication that it had ever been logged, even though I had a distinct memory of doing so. My handwritten entry from the day before was disappeared from the form as well. We had talked extensively about the journal's peculiar contents during lunch yesterday, but Supervisor Dawson had no memory of our conversation when I brought this up to him. After a brief investigation into a possible security breach, the case was dismissed and attributed to a clerical error when no evidence of tampering with the archive room locks was found. A string of odd event reports surfaced from the Olympic National Forest in October 2001, precisely 21 years after Mercer's name first appeared in the Forest Service employment records and in line with the cycle foreseen in Whitaker's hidden note. 3 distinct hiking groups that are not related to. On paths in the park's northern region, they reported coming into what they called an antiquated forest ranger. These allegations claim that the ranger, a man in his 50s who was dressed in what one witness described as a vintage uniform, contacted hikers who had deviated from approved trails, told them to go back to the official pathways, and then disappeared into the forest. Russell Hammond, an amateur photographer who was one of the witnesses, stated that he had snapped a picture of the ranger from a distance, but that when the film was developed, the figure merely showed up as a shadow in place of a person, a dark blur against the woods. On October 28, 2001, Hammond's photo appeared in the Peninsula Daily News, along with a story about growing paranormal claims related to the National Forest. Although they acknowledged that no staff were assigned to patrol those particular regions, Forest Service authorities rejected the sightings as either a practical joker or a misidentification of a legitimate ranger, on the specified dates. The most interesting recent development in the Mercer case occurred in 2007, when a sealed metal box concealed inside a wall cavity was discovered during renovations at the former North District Ranger Station. Several things are in the box, which looks to have been put there during early 1960s restorations. A single sheet of paper displaying what looks to be Mercer's identification number, a compass with a shattered face, and a needle fixed pointing west-northwest, and a Forest Service badge. Be a section of a journal entry that matches Mercer's known samples in handwriting. The portion says, "Have discovered the pattern now. The cabin appears every 21 years, remaining accessible for 33 days. I have been here before. Will be here again." Water damage has made the rest of the inscription unreadable. Representatives from the Forest Service arrived within hours after learning about this discovery and seized the objects, alleging historical importance to current research. When questioned by reporters, Forest Service officials deny any knowledge of the box's discovery, and no official announcement regarding its contents has ever been made. The Mercer case may be comparable to previous disappearances in national parks and forests around the Pacific Northwest, according to some researchers. 17 people, primarily seasoned hikers or forestry workers, disappeared between 1946 and 1982, under conditions that investigative journalist Amelia. In her contentious 1993 book Into Thin Air, Rutherford identified a specific pattern of aberrant elements. These common elements included disappearances during periods of odd weather, last known whereabouts close to unmarked or unmapped paths, and, in a few cases, the finding of personal belongings in areas that had been exhaustively explored. Law enforcement agencies and mainstream scientists reject any paranormal link between these events, attributing them to the natural. Rutherford's work has inspired a small but committed community of researchers who continue to look into what they believe may be evidence of temporary spatial anomalies in particular wilderness regions, despite the risks of wilderness environments and the limitations of search operations in large, challenging terrain. One of the most stunning and popular natural settings in America is still the Olympic National Forest. Every year, millions of hikers travel its paths without any problems, encountering just the old woodlands, serene seclusion, and breathtaking natural beauty, which haven't changed much throughout the years. Although they are rarely mentioned with outsiders, these safeguards have become normal practice among people who work these woods on a daily basis. Backup compasses are carried by rangers. They follow certain standards for missed communications and check in by radio on a regular basis. Every day, they download and examine the comprehensive GPS logs of their whereabouts. The most telling thing is that they nearly always work in pairs, or groups in specific forest locations, which closely match the regions associated with the Mercer case and the ensuing unusual reports. The story of Ranger Harlan Mercer is only an intriguing bit of local mythology, a campfire tale told to provide a welcome chill on chilly Northwest evenings to the majority of visitors to the Olympic National Forest. For others, especially those who research disappearances in wilderness regions, it continues to be a disturbing illustration of how even the most seasoned. The disorienting effects of isolation and harsh settings might affect outdoor enthusiasts. However, the Mercer instance signifies something much deeper for a few scholars. Proof that we still don't fully comprehend the physical world. That borders we consider to be set and absolute may, under some and uncommon circumstances, become unexpectedly permeable. And that there may be areas where the traditional laws of time and space function according to alternative norms. If you end up hiking, conventional wisdom advises marking your location and turning back if you encounter an unmarked track that deviates from the designated paths in the Olympic Peninsula's dense forests. Without a doubt, the Forest Service would caution against going in the wrong direction. However, pay attention to the sounds around you if your curiosity overcomes caution and you end up going that unfamiliar road. If the woodland becomes remarkably silent, if you see the shadows passing through the trees at odd angles, if you sense you might be getting close to one of those thin spots Joseph Silverwolf described. If you suddenly feel like you're being watched and recognized at the same time. And if you peek through the old trees up ahead, you can see what seems to be a clearing with a cottage that oddly looks both new and worn, both familiar and unattainable. Ranger Mercer had to make the same decision that you did in October 1959. The official recommendation is to turn around right away, note your location if you can, and then go back the way you came, without turning around. Go back to mark trails and notify the closest ranger station about the oddity. This is the sensible and safe option. However, if the more bizarre rumors of the Mercer case are true, a ranger may still be observing from a window or possibly from the tree in some place in those woods, waiting for someone to either break the cycle or join it. He was waiting for someone to comprehend what he had found more than 60 years ago in those forests, awaiting the journal entries to be read. He was. Writing in a cabin that exists both everywhere and nowhere, and is only reachable by those who happen to locate the correct trail at the right time, could still be possible. A cabin that has never existed, according to all official records.